Daniel Rivera had never imagined his life would amount to much more than the rhythm of strings beneath his calloused fingers and the cold concrete beneath his worn-out boots. At 32 years old, he had long accepted that his dreams of becoming a professional musician had faded into something more practical, something more survival than ambition. Every evening as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, Daniel would take his position at the same corner near Millennium Park, open his battered guitar case, and let his music spill into the indifferent rush of city life. February had arrived with its usual cruelty, bringing winds that cut through layers of clothing and turned every breath into visible proof of the cold. Daniel wore fingerless gloves that allowed him to play while keeping his hands from going completely numb, though on nights like this one, even that small protection felt inadequate. His apartment was a tiny studio in a building that should have been condemned years ago, where the heating worked sporadically and the neighbors cycled through so quickly he had stopped learning their names. The rent was cheap by Chicago standards, which meant it consumed nearly half of what he earned from street performances and his part-time shifts at a coffee shop in Wicker Park. The evening crowd moved past him in their familiar patterns, some people dropping coins or bills into his case without breaking stride, others pausing for a moment to listen before moving on to wherever they needed to be. Daniel had learned not to take the indifference personally. In a city of millions, everyone was struggling with something, fighting their own battles, nursing their own wounds. His music was just background noise to most of them, a soundtrack to their commute, easily forgotten by the time they reached their destinations. He was midway through a song he had written himself, one that never failed to make him feel something despite having played it hundreds of times, when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. An elderly man was walking slowly along the sidewalk, his gait unsteady, one hand pressed against the wall of a nearby building as if drawing stability from the brick and mortar. Daniel watched without stopping his playing, his fingers continuing their familiar dance across the strings even as his focus shifted. There was something wrong about the way the man moved, a kind of desperation in his shuffle that made Daniel's chest tighten with concern. The man took another few steps, and then his knees seemed to give out entirely. He crumpled to the sidewalk like a marionette whose strings had been cut, his body folding in on itself in a way that looked both sudden and inevitable. The sound of his collapse was softer than Daniel would have expected, swallowed almost immediately by the ambient noise of traffic and conversation. Several pedestrians glanced over but kept walking, their instinct for self-preservation or perhaps their fear of getting involved stronger than their concern for a stranger. Daniel did not think about what he should do. His hands simply stopped playing, and his body was already in motion before his mind had fully processed the decision. He left his guitar propped against the wall and his case open on the ground, containing maybe $40 or $50 in bills and change, the earnings of 3 hours of playing in the cold. None of that mattered. Someone needed help. He reached the man in seconds and dropped to his knees beside him, his hands hovering uncertainly for a moment before touching the stranger's shoulder. The man's face was pale, almost gray, and his lips had taken on a bluish tint that Daniel recognized from a CPR training course he had taken years ago when he briefly worked as a summer camp counselor. The man was not breathing, or if he was, it was so shallow that Daniel could not detect it. His phone was in his hand without him remembering pulling it from his pocket, his thumb stabbing at the emergency call button while his other hand searched for a pulse on the man's neck. There it was, faint and irregular, like a drum beat struggling to maintain its rhythm. The operator's voice came through clear and calm, asking questions Daniel answered automatically while his brain shifted into a strange state of heightened focus where everything seemed both very fast and very slow at once. Yes, the man was unconscious. No, he was not breathing normally. The location was the corner of East Randolph Street and North Michigan Avenue near the park. Yes, he knew CPR. The operator instructed him to begin chest compressions, and Daniel positioned his hands the way he had been taught, locking his elbows and using his body weight to press down on the man's sternum. He counted in his head, trying to maintain the rhythm, trying to be the heartbeat this stranger's body had temporarily forgotten how to sustain. A crowd began to form, people pulling out their phones to record or simply to bear witness to the small drama unfolding on the sidewalk. Daniel was barely aware of them. His world had narrowed to the rise and fall of his arms, the counting in his head, the desperate hope that he was doing this right, that he was helping and not somehow making things worse. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cold, and his shoulders began to burn with the effort, but he did not stop. It might have been 3 minutes or 10 when he heard the sirens approaching, their wail cutting through the city noise like a knife. The paramedics arrived with their equipment and their professional calm, taking over with practiced efficiency. They asked Daniel questions while they worked, and he answered as best he could, explaining that he had just seen the man collapse, that he did not know him, that he had started CPR as soon as he realized the man was not breathing. They got the man onto a stretcher, attaching monitors and inserting an IV line with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. As they prepared to load him into the ambulance, something unexpected happened. The elderly man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but undeniably conscious. His gaze wandered across the faces around him until it landed on Daniel, and something like recognition crossed his features even though they had never met. His hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, reached out and grabbed Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. The man's lips moved, forming words that Daniel could not quite hear over the noise of the crowd and the idling ambulance engine. He leaned closer, and the man whispered something that sounded like "Thank you, son," before his eyes closed again and his grip loosened. The paramedics gently moved Daniel aside, and within seconds the ambulance doors were closing and the vehicle was pulling away into traffic, lights flashing red and blue against the buildings. Daniel stood there on the sidewalk, breathing hard, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exertion. Someone touched his shoulder and said something about him being a hero, but the word felt too big, too significant for what had just happened. He had just done what anyone should do, what he hoped someone would do for him if their positions were reversed. There was nothing heroic about basic human decency. When he turned back to his spot on the corner, his heart sank. His guitar case was empty, every dollar gone, taken by someone who had seen an opportunity in his absence. The guitar itself was still there, at least, propped against the wall where he had left it. Someone in the crowd must have been watching it, or perhaps even thieves had some lines they would not cross. He picked up the instrument and checked it over, relieved to find it undamaged. A woman approached him, maybe in her 50s, wearing an expensive-looking coat. She pressed a $20 bill into his hand and told him she had seen everything, that what he did was beautiful. Others came forward too, adding bills to his empty case, more money than he would have made in the rest of the evening. But Daniel felt hollow, unable to shake the image of that old man's face, the desperate grip of his hand, the whispered words he could barely hear. He packed up his guitar and walked to the train station, his fingers too cold and his mind too scattered to play any more that night. On the ride back to his neighborhood, he stared at his reflection in the dark window and wondered if the man would survive, if he had family waiting at the hospital, if anyone would tell them about the street musician who had tried to help. He wondered if he would ever know what happened, or if this would just become another story he carried with him, another moment that mattered intensely for a brief time before being buried under the weight of everyday survival. When Daniel finally reached his apartment and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door, exhaustion hit him all at once. He set his guitar in the corner, peeled off his damp clothes, and collapsed onto his bed without bothering to turn on the lights. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of strangers falling and hands reaching out in the dark, always just beyond his grasp. The days that followed the incident blurred together in the way that ordinary days always did for Daniel. He woke up, went to his coffee shop job, came home to practice guitar for an hour or two, then headed out to his corner near Millennium Park for the evening performances. The routine was comfortable in its predictability, a rhythm he had fallen into so completely that deviation felt almost impossible. But something had shifted inside him, some small crack in the foundation of how he saw the world. He found himself watching people more carefully now, noticing the elderly crossing streets, the ones who moved slowly or seemed unsteady on their feet. A part of him was always slightly on alert, waiting for another moment when someone would need help. His roommate Marcus, a graphic designer who spent most of his time locked in his bedroom working on freelance projects, noticed the change one evening when they happened to be in the kitchen at the same time. Marcus was reheating leftover Chinese food in the microwave when he asked Daniel about the bandage on his hand. Daniel had scraped his palm on the sidewalk during the CPR attempt and had not even noticed until the next day when the skin had started to hurt. He told Marcus the whole story while they stood in the narrow kitchen, the microwave humming between them. Marcus listened with widening eyes, stopping mid-bite when Daniel described the moment the old man grabbed his wrist. "That's intense, man," Marcus said, shaking his head slowly. "Did you ever find out what happened to him, like did he make it?" Daniel had not found out, and the not knowing sat in his chest like a stone. He had no name, no way to follow up, no connection to the situation beyond those few minutes on the sidewalk. The paramedics had not asked for his contact information beyond the initial emergency call, and he had not thought to ask them for any way to get updates. The man had simply disappeared into the medical system, and Daniel was left with only the memory and the questions. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, running his hand through his hair. "I hope so. He looked pretty bad, but he woke up for a second before they took him away. That has to be a good sign, right?" Marcus nodded, though neither of them really knew. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Marcus clapped Daniel on the shoulder and told him he did a good thing, that most people would have just kept walking. Daniel wanted to argue to say that surely that was not true, that people were generally decent when it came down to it. But he remembered the crowd filming on their phones, the person who stole his earnings while he was trying to save a life, and the words died in his throat. February continued its cold assault on Chicago. Daniel performed through snow flurries and biting winds, his fingers growing more skilled at playing even when they felt like frozen blocks of wood. Tips were lighter in bad weather because fewer people stopped, but he had learned long ago that consistency mattered more than perfect conditions. Show up every day, play your best, and eventually the good days balanced out the bad ones. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The memory of the collapsed man began to fade slightly, moving from the front of Daniel's mind to a place further back where important moments lived after their immediate urgency had passed. He still thought about it sometimes, especially when he played at that corner, but it no longer consumed him the way it had in the first few days. On a Tuesday morning in mid-March, Daniel was enjoying his one day off from the coffee shop by sleeping late and allowing himself the luxury of a slow morning. He had just poured his second cup of coffee when someone knocked on the apartment door with an official-sounding rhythm that immediately made his stomach clench with anxiety. Unexpected knocks never brought good news. They brought landlords complaining about late rent, or neighbors upset about noise, or occasionally police looking for someone who used to live in the building. He opened the door to find a courier in a professional uniform holding a clipboard and a large envelope. The woman asked if he was Daniel Rivera, checked his identification when he confirmed, and had him sign for the delivery. The envelope was made of heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that spoke of money and importance. His name and address were printed in an elegant font, and the return address simply read Morrison and Associates with a downtown Chicago address. Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands after closing the door, his heart beating faster for reasons he could not quite identify. He knew no one at a law firm. He had never been involved in any legal matters beyond a parking ticket 2 years ago that he had paid immediately. For a brief, irrational moment, he wondered if he was being sued for something related to the CPR incident, if maybe he had done something wrong and the man's family was coming after him. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was thick and expensive feeling, and the letterhead at the top matched the return address. He read the first line once, then again, then a third time because the words refused to make sense in any configuration his brain could accept. Dear Mr. Rivera, our firm represents the estate of Mr. Robert William Ashford. We are writing to request your presence at our offices at your earliest convenience to discuss a matter of significant importance regarding Mr. Ashford's final wishes. Please contact our office to schedule an appointment. The letter continued with contact information and office hours, signed by someone named Margaret Chen with a list of credentials after her name. Daniel read it 4 more times, trying to find meaning in the formal language. The name Robert Ashford meant nothing to him. He knew no one by that name, had no connection to anyone who might leave him anything in a will, had no reason whatsoever to be contacted by an estate lawyer. He pulled out his phone and called the number listed on the letterhead. A receptionist answered with a polished greeting, and Daniel stumbled through an explanation that he had received a letter and was calling to find out what this was about. The receptionist put him on hold for less than a minute before a woman's voice came on the line, introducing herself as Margaret Chen. Mr. Rivera, thank you for calling so promptly, she said, her tone professional but somehow warm at the same time. I understand this letter must be quite confusing. I'm afraid I cannot discuss the details over the phone, but I assure you this is a legitimate matter and not any kind of scam or solicitation. Would you be available to come to our office tomorrow afternoon? Daniel's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Can you at least tell me who Robert Ashford is? I don't know anyone by that name. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of papers shuffling. Mr. Ashford passed away 3 weeks ago. According to our records and the information he provided before his death, you encountered him on February 14th of this year. Does that date have any significance for you? February 14th. Valentine's Day, the day he had performed CPR on a dying stranger, the day that had felt both monumental and ordinary, significant and forgettable. Understanding crashed over Daniel like a wave, taking his breath away. The man who collapsed, he said, barely above a whisper, near Millennium Park, that was Robert Ashford. Yes, Margaret Chen confirmed, Mr. Ashford was hospitalized following that incident and remained in the hospital until his passing on March 7th. He was lucid and of sound mind during much of that time, and he made certain legal arrangements that involve you directly. I really must insist that we discuss this in person. Would 2 o'clock tomorrow work for your schedule? Daniel agreed without thinking about whether he was supposed to work, without considering anything beyond the desperate need to understand what was happening. He wrote down the address even though it was on the letter, needing something to do with his hands, some action that felt concrete and real. When the call ended, he sat on his worn couch and stared at the wall, his coffee growing cold on the table beside him. Marcus came home that evening to find Daniel still sitting in roughly the same position, the letter clutched in his hand. Daniel told him everything, speaking quickly and probably not very coherently, watching Marcus's expression shift from confusion to shock to something like excitement. Marcus insisted this had to be good news, that estate lawyers did not contact random people unless money was involved, that maybe the old man had left him a reward or something for saving his life. But Daniel could not shake the feeling that this was all a mistake, that he would show up at the fancy law office downtown and discover there had been some confusion, some mix-up with names or identities. He had not saved Robert Ashford's life, not really. The man had died 3 weeks later in a hospital. All Daniel had done was buy him a little more time, kept his heart beating long enough for real medical professionals to take over. That did not deserve a reward. That deserved nothing more than the thank you the man had whispered in those brief seconds of consciousness. Sleep did not come easily that night. Daniel lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the building, the pipes clanking and neighbors arguing and sirens passing in the street below. He thought about the old man, Robert Ashford, lying in a hospital bed knowing he was dying, thinking about the stranger who had knelt beside him on a cold sidewalk. What had gone through his mind in those final weeks? What had he felt that made him reach out to a lawyer and arrange something that required Daniel's presence at a law office? When morning finally came, Daniel called in sick to the coffee shop for the first time in 8 months. He spent an hour deciding what to wear, eventually settling on the only button-down shirt he owned and a pair of jeans that did not have any holes. He took the train downtown, watching the city transform from his neighborhood's worn buildings to the gleaming towers of the Loop. The law office was in one of those towers, on the 32nd floor with windows that looked out over the lake. The reception area was exactly what Daniel had imagined a high-end law office would look like, all dark wood and leather furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than Daniel made in a year. He gave his name to the receptionist, a young man with perfect hair who smiled and asked him to take a seat. Daniel sat on the edge of a leather chair, his hands clasped between his knees, feeling like an imposter in this world of expensive suits and quiet confidence. Margaret Chen appeared within 5 minutes, a woman in her 50s with silver streaking through her black hair and an expression that managed to be both serious and kind. She shook Daniel's hand with a firm grip and led him down a hallway lined with office doors, each with a brass nameplate. Her office was corner-facing with windows on 2 walls, a massive desk dominating the space. She gestured for Daniel to sit in one of the chairs facing the desk while she settled into her own chair and opened a thick folder. "Mr. Rivera," she began, her hands folded on top of the folder. "I want to start by saying that what I'm about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable. I've been practicing estate law for 27 years, and this is one of the most unusual situations I've ever encountered. I need you to keep an open mind and know that everything I'm telling you is completely legitimate and legally binding." Daniel nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Margaret Chen opened the folder and pulled out several documents, arranging them on the desk between them. She looked at Daniel with an expression that might have been sympathy or concern, and then she told him something that shattered his entire understanding of his life and his future. Part 3 Full Written Story, 2,500 words. Margaret Chen pulled out a photograph from the folder and slid it across the polished desk. Daniel leaned forward and found himself looking at a professional headshot of the man from the sidewalk. Though this version was healthier, more vibrant, taken perhaps a year or two before their encounter. Robert Ashford had kind eyes, Daniel noticed, the sort of eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and wisdom in equal measure. Robert William Ashford was 78 years old at the time of his death, Margaret began, her voice steady and professional. He was a retired architect, quite successful in his field, though he lived relatively modestly given his means. He had no living spouse, no children who survived him, and no close relatives of any kind. His only son, Michael, died in a car accident 12 years ago. Daniel listened, trying to understand why any of this involved him. He watched Margaret's hands as she sorted through documents, noting the way she handled each piece of paper with careful precision, as if the weight of words required physical reverence. Mr. Ashford was walking to a doctor's appointment on February 14th when he suffered a massive heart attack. According to the paramedics' report and witness statements, you performed CPR on him for approximately 7 minutes before emergency services arrived. Your actions kept blood flowing to his brain and vital organs during that critical window, The doctors told him that without your intervention, he would have died on that sidewalk. The words hung in the air between them. Daniel wanted to interrupt, to explain that he had just done what anyone would do, but Margaret continued before he could find his voice. Mr. Ashford spent 3 weeks in the cardiac intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He underwent surgery, but the damage to his heart was extensive. The doctors were clear with him about his prognosis. He had weeks, perhaps a month or two at most. During that time, he was lucid and mentally sharp, and he spent a great deal of energy trying to locate you. He was looking for me. Daniel's voice came out rougher than he intended. Margaret nodded. He had given the paramedics your name and phone number at the scene, but there had been some confusion in the records. It took his private investigator nearly 2 weeks to track you down definitively. Once he had your information, Mr. Ashford contacted me. I visited him in the hospital on February 28th, and he gave me very specific instructions about his estate. She pulled out a legal document, multiple pages bound together with a blue backing sheet. Daniel recognized it as a will, though he had never actually seen one in person before. Margaret turned to a marked page and rotated the document so Daniel could read it, though the legal language was dense and difficult to parse. Mr. Ashford's estate is valued at approximately $4.2 million, Margaret said, and Daniel felt the room tilt slightly around him. This includes his home in Lincoln Park, which is fully paid off and currently valued at $1.3 million. He has investment accounts, savings, a portfolio of stocks and bonds, and a collection of vintage musical instruments that has been appraised at around $300,000. There are also some personal effects and smaller assets. The numbers were too large to process. Daniel had never had more than $3,000 in his bank account at one time, and that had been briefly after a particularly good month of performances combined with tax return money. $4.2 million was not a real number to him. It was a lottery fantasy, a daydream, something that happened to other people in movies and news stories. I don't understand, Daniel managed to say. Why are you telling me this? Margaret Chen looked at him with an expression that contained both professional neutrality and something deeper, something almost moved. Because Mr. Ashford left everything to you, Daniel, his entire estate. You are the sole beneficiary of his will. You are the sole beneficiary of his will. The words did not make sense. They were in English, arranged in a grammatically correct sentence, but they refused to translate into meaning that Daniel's brain could accept. He stared at Margaret, waiting for the punchline, for the explanation that would make this reasonable and small and manageable. That's not possible, he said finally. I don't even know him. I didn't know him. We never met before that night. I just happened to be there. Anyone would have done the same thing. But they didn't, Margaret said softly. According to the witness statements we collected, approximately 30 people walked past Mr. Ashford in the first minute after he collapsed. Several looked directly at him. You were the only one who stopped. You were the only one who helped. Daniel shook his head, standing up from his chair because sitting felt impossible suddenly, because his body needed to move or he was going to crawl out of his skin. He walked to the window and looked out at the city spread below, the lake beyond it gray and cold under an overcast sky. This has to be a mistake. There must be other family, someone who actually deserves this. I can't just take a dead man's entire life because I did CPR. There is no other family, Margaret said from behind him. Mr. Ashford was very clear about that, and we did our due diligence to verify. His parents are long deceased. He was an only child. His wife died 8 years ago from cancer, and his son Michael was his only child. Michael left no children of his own. Robert Ashford spent the last years of his life quite alone. Daniel turned back to face her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Then donate it to charity, give it to a hospital or a music school or something. I don't want money for doing the right thing. That's not why I helped him. Margaret stood as well, walking around her desk to stand a few feet from Daniel. She was shorter than him, but she had a presence that made her seem taller, a kind of authority that came from years of handling people's grief and shock and disbelief. I understand this is overwhelming, she said. Mr. Ashford anticipated that you might feel this way. He left you a letter. I think you should read it before you make any decisions. She returned to her desk and pulled out an envelope from the folder, this one standard white paper, sealed and with Daniel's name written on the front in shaky handwriting. She handed it to Daniel, and he took it with numb fingers. The paper felt ordinary, just regular paper, but it suddenly seemed like the heaviest thing he had ever held. Would you like some privacy to read it? Margaret asked. Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Margaret told him she would be right outside and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. Daniel stood there with the envelope in his hands, afraid to open it, afraid of what words a dying man had written to a stranger. Finally, because there was nothing else to do, he carefully tore open the seal and pulled out 2 sheets of paper covered in the same shaky handwriting. "Dear Daniel," it began. "I hope you don't mind me using your first name, though we were never properly introduced. I am writing this from my hospital bed, 2 weeks after you saved my life on a cold February evening. The doctors tell me I don't have much time left, and I find myself thinking a great deal about time, about how we spend it, about what matters in the end." Daniel's eyes moved down the page, taking in words that felt intimate and raw. A dying man's confession to a stranger who had briefly been the most important person in his world. "I spent my entire life building things. I was an architect and I was good at my job. I designed buildings that will stand long after I'm gone, structures that house people's lives and work and dreams. But I realize now that I forgot to build the things that actually matter. I built a career but neglected my marriage. I built a reputation but missed my son's childhood. I built wealth but surrounded myself with emptiness." The letter went on, describing how Robert had lost his wife to cancer, how the grief had revealed the hollowness of their relationship, how they had lived like polite strangers for years. It described his son Michael, who had died angry at his father, who had spent his last years barely speaking to Robert because of old wounds that never healed. Robert wrote about the loneliness of his final years, the way he had moved through the city like a ghost, unknown and unnoticed. "When I collapsed on that sidewalk, I was on my way to a doctor's appointment where I suspected he would give me bad news. I had been having chest pains for weeks, but kept putting off getting help because what difference did it make? Who would care whether I lived or died? I had no one waiting for me, no one who would notice my absence beyond maybe my lawyer and accountant." Daniel had to stop reading for a moment because his vision was blurring with tears. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and continued. "And then you appeared. You stopped your life, abandoned your work, and fought to keep me alive even though you didn't know me, even though I was just another stranger in a city full of strangers. In the ambulance, before I lost consciousness again, I heard one of the paramedics say that someone had stolen money from your guitar case while you were saving me. You lost money because you chose to help me. That detail has haunted me in the best possible way." The letter described how Robert had spent his remaining weeks thinking about that moment, about what it meant that a struggling street musician had sacrificed his own well-being for someone he would never see again. He wrote about looking up Daniel's social media, learning bits and pieces about his life, seeing photos of him with his guitar. "I cannot give you back the time I wasted or repair the relationships I destroyed. But I can give you something I never properly used. My money sat in accounts, growing through investment but serving no real purpose beyond making numbers on a screen get larger. My home has been empty except for me for years. My possessions gathered dust. None of it brought me happiness or meaning. None of it mattered in the moment I was dying on that sidewalk. The only thing that mattered was you, a stranger who chose kindness over convenience." Robert explained that he knew Daniel would feel uncomfortable accepting the inheritance, that he would think it was too much for such a simple act. But he insisted that Daniel's act was not simple at all, that it represented something rare and precious in a world that increasingly taught people to look away from suffering, to assume someone else would help, to prioritize self-interest above communal responsibility. "I'm not giving you this money as payment for saving my life," Robert wrote. "I'm giving it to you because I spent my final weeks watching how you live yours. I saw your social media posts about playing music for elementary school kids for free. I read an interview you did for a local blog about how art should be accessible to everyone regardless of their economic status. I learned that you work 2 jobs to stay afloat, but still find time to volunteer at a homeless shelter. You are the kind of person who would have done something meaningful with opportunities I squandered." The letter ended with a request that was somehow both humble and demanding. "Please don't refuse this gift out of guilt or some sense that you don't deserve it. I watched people walk past me when I was dying. You didn't. That choice reveals something about who you are, and I believe you will use these resources in ways I never could. Build something beautiful with this, Daniel. Build the life I forgot to live. And maybe sometimes, when you think of me, remember that at the very end, a stranger's kindness was the only thing that mattered. Thank you for giving me a few more weeks to understand what I spent 78 years missing. Yours in gratitude, Robert William Ashford." Daniel stood in Margaret Chen's office with tears running down his face, the letter trembling in his hands, and finally allowed himself to understand that this was real, that a dying man had looked at his wasted life and chosen to believe that a stranger might redeem it in ways he never could. Margaret Chen returned to find Daniel sitting in the chair by the window, the letter folded carefully in his lap, his face wet with tears he had not bothered to hide. She did not comment on his emotional state, simply returned to her desk and gave him the space to compose himself. When he finally looked up at her, she offered him a tissue box without ceremony, and he took several, wiping his face and blowing his nose like a child. "I don't know what to do," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to accept something like this." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression gentle but practical. "You don't have to decide everything right now. The probate process will take several weeks at minimum, possibly a few months. During that time, we'll handle all the legal requirements, pay off any outstanding debts from the estate, handle taxes, and prepare for the transfer of assets. What I need from you today is simply confirmation that you're willing to accept the inheritance. If you refuse it, the estate will go through intestate succession, which means the state will take possession and eventually transfer everything to state coffers since there are no living relatives." The thought of Robert's lifetime of work and savings simply disappearing into government accounts felt wrong somehow, like a final insult to a man who had spent his last conscious weeks trying to make meaning from his life. Daniel nodded slowly, the gesture feeling like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "Okay," he said. "Yes, I'll accept it. I don't understand why he chose me, but I'll honor his decision." Margaret smiled for the first time since Daniel had arrived, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her professional demeanor into something more human. "That's exactly the right answer. Now there are quite a few documents you'll need to sign, and I need to walk you through the various components of the estate. Do you have time this afternoon, or would you prefer to schedule another appointment?" Daniel thought about his shift at the coffee shop that he had called off, about his empty evening without any plans, about the guitar that sat in his apartment waiting for his evening performance. All of it seemed to belong to a different life now, a version of himself that existed just this morning but already felt distant and unrecognizable. "I have time," he said. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of legal terminology and document signing. Margaret walked Daniel through an itemized list of everything included in the estate. The house in Lincoln Park was a 3-bedroom brownstone built in the 1920s, fully renovated 10 years ago, with original hardwood floors and a small garden in back. There were photographs of it in the file, and Daniel stared at images of a place more beautiful than anywhere he had ever imagined living. The investment portfolio was divided among several accounts, managed by a financial advisor Margaret recommended Daniel meet with soon. There were stocks, bonds, mutual funds, retirement accounts that Robert had never gotten to use, all of it adding up to numbers that still refused to feel real. Margaret explained that after estate taxes and legal fees, Daniel would likely clear around $3.7 million in liquid assets, plus the house and other physical property. The musical instrument collection surprised Daniel most of all. Robert had apparently been a collector of vintage guitars, cellos, violins, and even a few rare pianos that were currently in climate-controlled storage. Margaret showed Daniel an appraisal document listing dozens of instruments, some dating back over 100 years. There was a Martin acoustic guitar from 1937 worth $60,000, a Stradivarius violin copy that still commanded $20,000, a Gibson Les Paul from 1959 worth over $100,000. Why did he collect these if he didn't play? Daniel asked, running his finger down the list of instruments. Margaret consulted her notes. According to the information Mr. Ashford provided, his son Michael was musically talented. Robert started collecting instruments when Michael was young, hoping to encourage his interest. But their relationship deteriorated as Michael got older, and apparently Michael stopped playing music around age 16. Robert kept collecting anyway, perhaps hoping that one day they would reconnect through it. They never did. The sadness of that struck Daniel deeply. He imagined Robert purchasing beautiful instruments year after year, each one a small prayer that his son would come back to him, that music would bridge the distance between them. All those guitars and violins sitting unused in storage, waiting for reconciliation that never came. What happens to the instruments? Daniel asked. They're yours, part of the estate. You can keep them, sell them, donate them, whatever you choose. Daniel thought about his own battered acoustic guitar, the one he played every evening on the street, the one that had been his constant companion for 8 years. It was worth maybe $200 on a good day, but he loved it with an intensity that transcended monetary value. Now he owned instruments worth more than most people's houses, instruments that had sat silent and neglected, purchased out of grief and hope rather than joy. By the time Margaret finished explaining everything, Daniel's head was spinning. She gave him her business card and several other documents, explaining that she would be in touch regularly as the probate process moved forward. She also gave him a key, which confused him until she explained that it was for Robert's house. The property is currently empty, she said. The utilities are still on, paid automatically from estate accounts. You're welcome to visit it anytime. In fact, I'd encourage you to spend some time there before the official transfer happens. Mr. Ashford's personal effects are still in the house, and you might find it helpful to understand more about him. While Daniel pocketed the key, feeling its weight like a talisman or a burden, he could not decide which. He thanked Margaret, shook her hand again, and walked out of the office in a daze. The elevator ride down 32 floors felt like descending from another dimension. By the time he emerged onto the street, the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. He walked without destination, his feet carrying him north along Michigan Avenue while his mind tried to process what had just happened. Every few blocks he would stop and pull out his phone, intending to call someone to share this impossible news, but who could he call? Marcus would be excited but would not really understand the weight of it. His few other friends were acquaintances more than confidants. His parents had passed away years ago in a house fire, and he had no siblings. Eventually, Daniel found himself standing outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the place where Robert had spent his final weeks. He had not consciously walked here, but his subconscious had apparently decided this was important. He stood on the sidewalk looking up at the massive building, thinking about Robert lying in a bed somewhere in there, using his last days to track down a stranger and give away everything he owned. On impulse, Daniel walked into the hospital and approached the information desk. He asked if there was any record of Robert Ashford having been a patient there recently, knowing it was a long shot that they would tell him anything due to privacy laws. The woman at the desk typed on her computer for a moment, then looked up with a sympathetic expression. "Mr. Ashford passed away last month," she said gently. "Are you family?" "Well, it's something like that," Daniel said, and realized it was true in a way he was only beginning to understand. The woman directed him to the cardiac wing where Robert had been treated. Daniel took the elevator up, not sure what he was looking for but feeling pulled by some need to walk the same halls Robert had walked. The cardiac intensive care unit was quiet, all hushed voices and beeping monitors. He stood in the hallway feeling like an intruder until a nurse noticed him and asked if she could help. Daniel explained who he was, or tried to, the words coming out clumsy and inadequate. The nurse's face changed when he mentioned Robert's name, something like recognition and sadness crossing her features. "You're the musician," she said. "The one who saved him. He talked about you constantly. He showed everyone the videos he found of you playing on the street." The idea of Robert watching videos of his performances felt intimate and strange, like someone had been watching Daniel through a window without his knowledge. "He really spent all that time thinking about me." The nurse nodded. "He was very weak, but he was determined to find you. He had a private investigator coming to the hospital and a lawyer visiting almost daily. I've been a nurse for 15 years, and I've never seen someone use their final days quite like that. Most people in his situation are focused on pain management and saying goodbye. Mr. Ashford was focused entirely on you and making sure his wishes were carried out properly." She paused, looking at Daniel with an assessing expression. "He was a complicated man, I think. He had a lot of regrets. But he seemed peaceful at the end, like he had found a way to make something right. I hope whatever he planned worked out the way he wanted." Daniel felt his throat tighten again. "It did. He gave me everything. I just don't know if I deserve it." The nurse reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of comfort. "If he chose you, then you do. Dying people don't waste their last days on mistakes. They finally get clear about what matters. Trust his judgment." Daniel thanked her and left the hospital, her words echoing in his mind. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He checked his phone and realized it was nearly 7, the time he would normally be setting up at his corner near Millennium Park. The thought of going there felt impossible now, like trying to step back into a life that no longer fit. Instead, he found himself pulling out the key Margaret had given him and looking up the address for Robert's house. It was about 2 miles away, walkable in 40 minutes or a short train ride. Daniel chose to walk, needing the movement, needing the time to prepare himself for whatever he would find there. The neighborhood transformed as he walked north and slightly west, the buildings becoming more elegant, the streets cleaner and quieter. Lincoln Park was a wealthy area, the kind of place Daniel usually only passed through on his way to somewhere else. Robert's house was on a tree-lined street of similar brownstones, each one beautiful and well-maintained, each one worth more money than Daniel had ever imagined possessing. He stood on the sidewalk in front of Robert's house as the streetlights flickered on, looking at the dark windows and the small garden visible through a wrought iron fence. Somewhere inside that building was the life Robert had lived, the things he had owned, the space he had occupied during his final lonely years. Daniel was about to inherit all of it, about to step into a dead man's existence and somehow make it his own. He climbed the front steps and put the key in the lock, his hand shaking slightly. The door opened smoothly, well-maintained, and recently oiled. Daniel stepped inside and fumbled for a light switch, finding it after a moment of blind searching. The lights came on, revealing a hardwood entryway with a staircase leading up to the second floor and doorways opening to rooms on either side. The house smelled slightly stale from being closed up, but underneath that was something else. A scent that might have been furniture polish or old books or simply the accumulated smell of someone's life. Daniel closed the door behind him and stood very still, almost afraid to move further, feeling like an intruder in this beautiful, empty, grief-soaked space. Daniel moved through Robert's house like an archaeologist exploring ancient ruins, each room revealing layers of a life lived in accumulation and solitude. The front room to his left was clearly a formal living space, with furniture that looked expensive but rarely used, positioned in conversation groupings that suggested entertaining guests who never came. A thin layer of dust covered the coffee table, and the throw pillows on the couch sat in perfect arrangement, undisturbed by human contact for what might have been months. The dining room was similar, a beautiful table that could seat 8 surrounded by chairs that had probably not supported weight in years. There were place settings arranged as if for a dinner party, plates and silverware and glasses positioned with precise care, a tableau frozen in time representing meals never shared. Daniel found himself wondering if Robert had set the table this way intentionally, creating the illusion of a life more full than the reality, or if it had simply been left this way from some long-ago gathering and never changed. The kitchen was more lived in, showing signs of actual daily use. The coffee maker sat on the counter with a clean mug beside it. The refrigerator held mostly expired items, condiments, and a few containers of food that Daniel could not bring himself to open. But there were also signs of someone who cooked real meals for himself. A well-stocked spice rack, good quality pots and pans hanging from a rack above the stove, a knife block with expensive German steel. Daniel found himself touching things carefully, picking up a coffee mug and setting it down, opening a drawer to find neatly organized utensils, running his hand along the cool granite countertop. Each small discovery felt like learning something about Robert, piecing together the shape of his days. He had been alone but not chaotic, lonely but not depressed into paralysis. He had maintained his space and his routines even with no one there to witness them. A door off the kitchen led to what must have been Robert's home office. This room felt more personal than the others, less staged and more genuinely inhabited. The desk was large and covered with papers, architectural drawings, and magazines about design. There was a high-end computer setup, the monitors dark now but surrounded by sketches and notes. The walls were covered with framed blueprints and photographs of buildings, presumably projects Robert had worked on during his career. Daniel sat in the office chair and slowly spun around, taking in the space from Robert's perspective. This was where he had spent his time, working long after retirement on personal projects or perhaps simply keeping his mind engaged with the work that had defined him. There were books everywhere, architectural history and theory mixed with novels and memoirs, the reading material of someone who had vast amounts of time and no one to share it with. On one corner of the desk sat a framed photograph that stopped Daniel's slow rotation. It showed a younger Robert, maybe in his 50s, with his arm around a teenage boy who had to be Michael. They were standing in front of a half-constructed building, both wearing hard hats, both smiling at the camera. Michael looked so much like his father, the same eyes and jawline, the same way of standing. Robert's expression in the photo held such clear pride and joy that it hurt to look at, knowing how the story ended. Daniel picked up the photo and studied it more closely. Behind them in the image, barely visible, was another person taking measurements or consulting plans. The construction site looked busy and alive, full of the energy of creation. This must have been before everything fell apart between father and son, during whatever brief window existed when they still connected over shared interests. Robert had kept this photo on his desk where he would see it every day, torturing himself with memory or maybe holding on to the last piece of happiness he had known. Setting the photo down carefully, Daniel noticed a journal underneath a stack of architectural magazines. It was leather-bound and well-used, the kind of journal someone writes in regularly. Daniel knew he should not read it, that it felt like a violation of privacy. But Robert had left everything to him, including presumably the right to know who he had been. Daniel opened the journal to a random page dated about 6 months before Robert's death. The entry was short, just a few lines in Robert's shaky handwriting. Saw a father teaching his daughter to ride a bike in the park today. She kept falling and laughing, completely unafraid because he was there to catch her. I cannot remember if I ever taught Michael to ride a bike, or if I was too busy with work and his mother handled it. I cannot remember so many things that I should have been present for. How did I let an entire life happen without actually living it? Daniel closed the journal quickly, feeling like he had intruded on something too raw and painful. But he could not unsee those words, could not unknow the depth of Robert's regret. He stood up from the desk and left the office, needing to move, needing to escape the weight of all that accumulated sorrow. The second floor held 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall, a large space with windows overlooking the garden. The bed was made with hospital corners, the nightstand held a lamp and a book about urban planning, the closet contained rows of organized clothing. Everything was clean and maintained, but it felt more like a hotel room than someone's personal sanctuary, impersonal despite being filled with one man's possessions. The second bedroom had been converted into a library or reading room, with built-in bookshelves covering 2 walls and a comfortable reading chair positioned near a window. Daniel ran his fingers along the spines of books, hundreds of them organized by subject and then alphabetically by author. This was the collection of someone who read seriously and constantly, who used books as companionship in the absence of human connection. The third bedroom made Daniel's breath catch in his chest. Unlike the rest of the house, this room had not been maintained or updated. It was frozen in time, clearly preserved exactly as it had been years ago. Posters of rock bands from the 1990s covered the walls. A desk held a dusty computer monitor from the same era. The bookshelves contained young adult novels and textbooks, and in one corner sat a keyboard and a guitar stand that was empty, waiting for an instrument that would never return. This had been Michael's room, kept like a shrine to a son who died angry at his father, who never returned home after leaving for college. Daniel stood in the doorway looking at this preserved moment of adolescence and felt tears burning his eyes again. The entire house was a monument to loss and missed chances, every room holding some echo of the connections Robert had failed to maintain. He left Michael's room and walked back downstairs, needing to see something that felt less heavy with sadness. The basement door was in the kitchen, and Daniel opened it to find wooden stairs leading down into darkness. He found a light switch and descended into a finished basement that had been converted into a music room. This was where Robert's instrument collection lived. The walls were lined with climate-controlled display cases holding guitars and violins and various other instruments, each one positioned carefully and lit with soft LED lights. There was a piano in one corner, a beautiful baby grand that gleamed even in the dim light. Music stands sat empty, waiting for musicians who never came. The whole space felt like a museum exhibition, beautiful and sad and utterly silent. Daniel walked along the display cases, looking at instruments worth more than cars, each one with a small placard describing its history and significance. A 1959 Gibson Les Paul in sunburst finish. A Martin D28 from 1937 with Brazilian rosewood back and sides. A French violin from 1840 with a case lined in red velvet. Dozens of instruments, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship, each one purchased by a father hoping to bribe his way back into his son's affections. He found himself standing in front of the case holding the vintage Martin, staring at his own reflection in the glass with the guitar visible behind it. His reflection looked haunted and overwhelmed. A street musician standing in a room full of instruments he could never have afforded, inheriting a fortune from a man he never knew, carrying the weight of a stranger's regrets and unfinished business. Daniel pulled out his phone and called Marcus, suddenly desperate to hear a familiar voice. Marcus answered on the second ring, sounding worried. "Dude, where are you? I came home and you weren't here and you didn't answer my texts." "I'm at Robert's house," Daniel said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty music room. "Marcus, this is real. He left me everything. I'm standing in his basement surrounded by guitars worth more money than I'll make in my entire life." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Then Marcus said quietly, "Are you okay? You sound kind of messed up." "I don't know if I'm okay," Daniel admitted. "This house is so sad, Marcus. He lived here alone for years, just surrounded by all this stuff he bought trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. He kept his dead son's bedroom exactly the same as when he was a teenager. He has a whole room full of instruments he never played because he bought them for a kid who never came back." "That's heavy," Marcus said. "Do you want me to come there? You shouldn't be alone in a dead guy's house at night dealing with all this." Daniel almost said yes, almost asked Marcus to come keep him company in this beautiful, sad space. But something stopped him. This felt like something he needed to experience alone, needed to fully understand before sharing it with anyone else. "I'm okay," he said. "I think I need to spend some time here, try to understand who he was, but thank you." They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, just the sound of a friend's voice providing anchor and normalcy. When Daniel hung up, he sat down at the piano and lifted the fallboard to expose the keys. He had never learned to play piano properly, just enough to pick out simple melodies. But he pressed a few keys now, and the notes rang out pure and perfect in the empty room. He thought about playing something, maybe one of his own compositions, but it felt wrong somehow, like he had not earned the right to make music in this space yet. Instead, he just sat there with his hands resting on the keys, feeling the smooth ivory under his fingers, thinking about all the music that had never been played here, all the joy and connection these instruments had been meant to facilitate but never did. Eventually, Daniel stood and turned off the lights, climbing back upstairs to the main floor. He walked through the house one more time, looking at everything with new eyes now that he understood the story better. This was not just a collection of expensive possessions. This was evidence of a life spent accumulating things to fill the void where relationships should have been, a chronicle of substituting money for emotional work, a warning about what happened when you realized too late that you had built the wrong life. He locked the front door behind him when he left, standing on the porch looking at the quiet street. The house would be his soon, this beautiful monument to loneliness and regret. The question was what he would do with it, how he could possibly take this sad space and transform it into something that honored Robert's final wishes without being crushed under the weight of all that history. Daniel walked to the train station and rode back to his neighborhood in silence, declining to put in headphones or distract himself with his phone. He needed to think, needed to figure out how to move forward. By the time he reached his apartment building, it was nearly midnight. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door and let himself into the tiny studio that had been home for 4 years. The contrast was striking. Where Robert's house was large and empty, Daniel's apartment was small and full. Where Robert's space was elegant and carefully curated, Daniel's was chaotic and lived in. He had posters on the walls and clothes draped over chairs and dishes in the sink. His guitar sat in the corner next to a small amp, sheet music scattered on the floor around it. This place was messy and imperfect and completely his. Daniel sat on his bed and pulled out his phone, opening his banking app to check his balance out of habit. The number stared back at him, $842.16. In a few months, that number would have several more digits. In a few months, he would own a house in Lincoln Park and have access to millions of dollars and own instruments that belonged in museums. In a few months, his entire life would be different. But tonight, right now, he was still just Daniel Rivera, street musician, coffee shop employee, guy with $800 and a dream of maybe someday recording an album. The knowledge of what was coming felt surreal, like a story happening to someone else, like a movie he was watching rather than living. He lay back on his bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of his building and his neighborhood. Tomorrow he would have to figure out how to move forward, how to accept this impossible gift, how to build something meaningful from the pieces of Robert's broken life. But tonight he let himself simply exist in this in-between space, neither his old life nor his new one, suspended in the strange moment before everything changed forever. The following weeks passed in a strange state of doubled reality, where Daniel existed simultaneously in 2 different lives. During the day, he was still Daniel Rivera, the barista and street musician, showing up for his shifts at the coffee shop and performing on his corner near Millennium Park as if nothing had changed. But increasingly, his afternoons and evenings were consumed by meetings with lawyers and financial advisors and estate administrators, all the machinery of wealth transfer grinding slowly forward. Margaret Chen called him every few days with updates on the probate process. There were forms to sign and taxes to file and accounts to verify. Robert's financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Okoye who managed investments for several wealthy clients, sat down with Daniel in her downtown office and walked him through the portfolio with patience that never felt condescending. She explained stocks and bonds and mutual funds in simple terms, creating charts and graphs to help him visualize how the money worked. The important thing to understand, Patricia told him during their second meeting, is that this kind of wealth properly managed can be self-sustaining. You could live comfortably off the investment returns without ever touching the principal. But more importantly, you have the freedom now to think about what you actually want to do with your life rather than just what you need to do to survive. That concept felt more foreign than the actual dollar amounts. Daniel had spent his entire adult life in survival mode, calculating every purchase against his bank balance, choosing between paying rent on time or buying new guitar strings, existing in the constant low-level stress of financial precariousness. The idea of freedom from that stress was harder to process than inheriting millions of dollars. He told Patricia he was not ready to make any major decisions yet, that he needed time to adjust to the reality of the situation. She approved of this caution and suggested they meet monthly to review the accounts and discuss strategy once everything was officially transferred. In the meantime, the investments would continue to be managed as they had been under Robert's direction, steady and conservative and slowly growing. Daniel found himself returning to Robert's house frequently, usually in the late afternoons after his coffee shop shifts ended. He would let himself in with the key Margaret had given him and wander through the rooms, gradually becoming familiar with the space. He started bringing small things from his apartment, a book he was reading or a notebook for songwriting, leaving them on Robert's desk or the kitchen counter. Slowly, almost without conscious intention, he was beginning to inhabit the space, making it less of a museum and more of a place someone actually lived. One afternoon, he brought Marcus along to see the house. His roommate had been respectfully curious but not pushy about the inheritance, sensing that Daniel needed space to process everything. But Daniel wanted to share it with someone, wanted another person's reaction to help him understand his own feelings. Marcus stood in the entryway with his mouth literally hanging open, turning slowly to take in the hardwood floors and the elegant staircase and the chandelier that probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. "This is insane," he said finally. "This whole place is yours, like for real yours." "We'll be in a few more weeks," Daniel confirmed. "Come on, I'll show you the music room." They walked through the house with Daniel pointing out details he had discovered, the way afternoon light came through the dining room windows, the original crown molding in the living room, the surprisingly modern kitchen appliances hidden behind vintage cabinet faces. Marcus asked questions and made jokes to cover his obvious discomfort with the level of wealth on display. But when they reached the basement music room, he fell completely silent. "Holy hell," Marcus whispered, walking slowly along the instrument displays. "Daniel, this is crazy. This one guitar is worth more than everything I own combined. There are like 30 instruments down here." 43, Daniel said quietly. "I counted. 43 instruments that almost never got played because they were bought for the wrong reasons." Marcus turned to look at him, hearing something in Daniel's tone. "You sound sad about it." "I am sad about it," Daniel admitted. "This whole house is sad. Robert spent so much money trying to fix things that money can't fix, and all he did was end up alone in a beautiful house full of objects that reminded him of his failures." They sat on the floor of the music room with their backs against the wall, surrounded by instruments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Daniel told Marcus everything he had learned about Robert from the house, and the journal entries he had read, and the conversations with Margaret. He talked about Michael and the preserved bedroom, about the regrets and the loneliness, about the way Robert had spent his final weeks trying to give meaning to his death since he had failed to find meaning in his life. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus asked when Daniel finally fell silent. "I mean, you can't just live here alone like he did. That would be like inheriting his sadness along with his money." Daniel had been thinking about exactly that question for weeks, turning it over in his mind during sleepless nights and long train rides. The answer had been forming slowly, built from pieces of ideas and half-formed plans, but he had not spoken it aloud to anyone yet. "I want to do something with the music room," he said slowly, testing the words as he spoke them. Robert bought all these instruments hoping to connect with his son, hoping music would bridge the distance between them. It didn't work for him, but maybe it could work for other people. There are kids in this city who will never get to hold a guitar this nice, never get access to quality instruments or proper instruction. What if I opened this space up somehow? Made it available for lessons or practice or just for kids to come experience what real instruments feel like. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering, then he nodded slowly. "That's actually a really good idea. It's like taking the saddest thing about this place and flipping it into something positive, using what Robert couldn't figure out how to use." They talked through possibilities, ideas flowing more freely now that Daniel had spoken his intention aloud. Maybe he could work with local schools to identify talented kids who could not afford instruments or lessons. Maybe he could hire music teachers and offer free instruction on weekends. Maybe he could create a lending library of instruments so young musicians did not have to save for months to buy their first guitar. The house was big enough to accommodate all of it, and the money was certainly sufficient to fund whatever vision Daniel could imagine. By the time they left that evening, Daniel felt more purposeful than he had since Margaret Chen first told him about the inheritance. He had found a way forward that honored Robert's intentions without simply accepting the money as a personal windfall. He would be a steward of the resources rather than just a beneficiary, using them to create the connections Robert had failed to build. The next day, Daniel met with Margaret and told her about his ideas. She listened carefully, taking notes, and then smiled in a way that made her look years younger. "Mr. Ashford would have loved this," she said. "He spent his career designing buildings that served communities, spaces where people came together. Using his home for this purpose feels very aligned with who he was at his best." She explained that he could set up a nonprofit foundation to manage the educational programs, which would provide structure and tax benefits and legitimacy when approaching schools and parents. She knew nonprofit attorneys who could help with the setup, and Patricia could advise on how to fund it sustainably from the investment portfolio. Within an hour, what had been a vague idea in Daniel's mind had become a practical plan with concrete next steps. Daniel left the meeting feeling energized but also slightly overwhelmed by how quickly things were moving. He walked to Millennium Park and stood at his usual performing corner, the spot where he had been playing the night Robert collapsed. He had not performed here in over a week, too consumed with estate business and planning to maintain his old routine. His guitar was at the apartment, waiting for him to return to the life he knew before everything changed. But standing there now, Daniel realized that life was already gone. Not because the money made him too good for street performing, but because his purpose had shifted. He had spent years playing on this corner hoping someone would notice him, hoping for the break that would transform his music from hobby into career. That dream felt smaller now, not wrong but insufficient for the opportunity in front of him. He thought about Robert watching videos of him performing, seeing something in those recordings that made him believe Daniel was worth betting everything on. What had Robert seen? What quality or character had convinced a dying man that this particular stranger would use wealth wisely and generously? Daniel wanted to live up to that faith, wanted to prove that Robert's instinct had been correct. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Patricia, the financial advisor, calling with news that the final estate tax calculation had been completed and the number was lower than initially projected. This meant more money available for the foundation, more resources to fund the music education programs. Patricia sounded pleased, walking him through the revised numbers and explaining what it meant for his planning. When the call ended, Daniel stood for a moment longer at his corner, saying a silent goodbye to this version of his life. He would still play music, would still write songs and perform, but it would be in service of something larger now. The street musician who saved a stranger's life was becoming something else. Someone with resources and responsibility, and the weight of a dead man's hopes resting on his shoulders. He walked home slowly, taking a route that led him past the coffee shop where he worked. Through the window he could see his coworkers moving through the familiar dance of taking orders and making drinks, the job he had done for 3 years and would soon leave behind. He had already given his notice, explaining vaguely that family circumstances had changed and he needed to focus on other things. His manager had been understanding, and his last shift was scheduled for the end of the week. Everything was ending and beginning at once. Everything was possible and terrifying in equal measure. Daniel climbed the stairs to his apartment and found Marcus cooking dinner, an unexpected gesture that filled him with gratitude. They ate together and watched a movie, doing nothing and talking about nothing important, just existing in the simple comfort of friendship and normalcy before everything became complicated again. Later that night, alone in his bed, Daniel pulled out his phone and looked at the photos he had taken of Robert's letter. He reread the words for probably the 20th time, paying particular attention to one passage near the end. Build something beautiful with this, Daniel. Build the life I forgot to live. He understood now that this was not just permission, but instruction. Robert was not giving Daniel money to make his own life easier. He was giving him resources to create what Robert had failed to create, to build connections and community and purpose. It was both a gift and a responsibility, both liberation and obligation. Daniel opened a notes app on his phone and started writing, letting ideas flow without judgment or filtering. He wrote about the foundation structure, about partnerships with schools, about how to recruit volunteer teachers and create curriculum. He wrote about the instruments, and which ones could be used for lending versus which should stay protected in the collection. He wrote about eventually maybe moving his own belongings into Robert's house, living there not as a lonely inheritor, but as someone actively filling the space with life and purpose. He wrote until his eyes burned with exhaustion, until words started to blur together, until he had poured out every idea and plan and dream that had been building in his mind for weeks. When he finally stopped, he had several thousand words of notes, a rough blueprint for transforming an inheritance into a legacy. Daniel set his phone aside and turned off the light, but sleep was elusive. His mind kept spinning with possibilities and questions, excitement and anxiety churning together into something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he had to jump, but not sure whether he would fly or fall. Tomorrow he would start making calls, reaching out to schools and nonprofit lawyers and music teachers. Tomorrow the abstract plans would start becoming concrete reality. But tonight, in the darkness of his small apartment, Daniel allowed himself to feel the full weight of what Robert had given him. Not just money and property, but trust. Robert had looked at his wasted life and chosen to believe that this particular stranger, This struggling musician with nothing but good intentions and calloused fingers could somehow do better. That faith was more valuable than any dollar amount, more precious than vintage guitars or lakefront property. That faith was worth building a whole new life around. That faith was worth building a whole new life around. 3 months after the envelope arrived at Daniel's door, the probate process finally concluded. Margaret Chen called him on a Thursday morning to inform him that all assets had been officially transferred into his name. The house was his, the accounts were his, the instruments were his. After months of existing in legal limbo, everything was suddenly, irrevocably real. Daniel sat in the coffee shop on his day off, staring at his phone after the call ended, trying to comprehend what he had just been told. He opened his banking app with shaking hands and saw numbers he had looked at dozens of times during the planning phase, but now they were not projected or estimated. They were actual balances in accounts that carried his name. $3.7 million, give or take, sitting in various investment accounts and accessible to him with a few clicks and transfers. He ordered another coffee even though he did not need one, just to have something to do with his hands. The barista was someone he had worked alongside for 2 years. A college student named Amber who made art on the side and always asked about his music. She knew he had quit but not why, and she chatted with him normally while making his latte, completely unaware that the guy she was talking to had just become a multimillionaire. That disconnect fascinated and disturbed Daniel in equal measure. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 months ago, wore the same thrift store clothes, and carried the same worn backpack. Nothing about his external appearance suggested that his circumstances had fundamentally transformed. He could walk through the world completely invisible in his wealth, and that invisibility felt both like privilege and alienation. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia asking if he had gotten the news and whether he wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss next steps. Daniel confirmed and set up an appointment for the following week. Then he called Marcus and told him simply, "It's official, everything transferred today." Marcus let out a whoop loud enough that Daniel had to pull the phone away from his ear. "Dude, that's amazing, we should celebrate. Let's go out tonight, my treat." "Well, I guess technically your treat since you're loaded now, but you know what I mean." They made plans to meet for dinner at a restaurant they had always wanted to try but could never afford. After hanging up, Daniel sat with his coffee and let himself feel the reality settle into his bones. This was permanent. This was his life now. The scared, struggling version of himself who had performed on street corners and stressed about rent was gone, replaced by someone with resources and options and responsibility. He walked to Robert's house, his house now, and let himself in with the key that belonged to him because everything belonged to him. The space still felt like Robert's in many ways, still held the imprint of the man who had lived here, but Daniel had been slowly changing it. He had moved some furniture around, taken down some of the more depressing artwork, filled the rooms with music when he visited. The house was beginning to breathe differently, to feel less like a museum and more like a home that was between occupants, waiting for someone to fully claim it. Daniel had been working with a nonprofit attorney named James for the past month to establish the Robert Ashford Music Foundation. The paperwork was nearly complete, the tax-exempt status application filed, the initial board of directors identified. James had been impressed by how thoughtfully Daniel approached the work, how seriously he took the responsibility of managing charitable assets. "Most people who suddenly come into money want to spend it on themselves first," James had told him. "The fact that your first instinct was to give it away to help kids tells me everything I need to know about your character." But Daniel did not feel particularly noble or charitable. He felt like he was fulfilling an obligation, honoring a contract he had entered into the moment he accepted the inheritance. Robert had given him this money with clear expectations about how it should be used, and Daniel was simply following those instructions. The fact that it aligned with his own values made it easier, but he was not sure it made him virtuous. He walked through the house to the basement music room, his favorite space in the entire building. He had started playing the instruments occasionally, carefully taking them out of their cases and running through scales and simple songs, trying to bring life and sound back into this too-quiet room. The vintage Martin had a tone unlike anything Daniel had played before, rich and complex, responding to the slightest touch. Playing it felt like a conversation with history, with all the musicians who had held this instrument across decades. Daniel sat down at the piano and played a melody he had been working on, a piece inspired by everything that had happened in the past few months. It started sad and minor, all the loneliness and regret that saturated this house, but gradually shifted into something more hopeful, new notes entering that suggested possibility and change. He was not skilled enough at piano to play it well, his fingers stumbling over the transitions, but the shape of it was there, the emotional arc he was trying to capture. When he finished, he sat with his hands resting on the keys, thinking about Michael, about the son who should have learned piano in this room, who should have grown up surrounded by music and support instead of distance and disappointment. Daniel wondered what Michael had been like, whether he had inherited his father's talent for design or his own aptitude for music. All the potential of a life cut short, all the reconciliation that never happened, leaving Robert alone with instruments nobody played. "I'm going to fill this room with kids," Daniel said aloud to the empty space, to Robert's ghost if such things existed. "I'm going to make this place so loud with music that you'll hear it wherever you are. That's what you wanted, right?" For all this to mean something. No answer came, just the settling sounds of an old house and traffic noise filtering in from the street above. But Daniel felt something shift in his chest, some knot of anxiety loosening slightly. He was finding his way forward, creating a vision that honored both Robert's wishes and his own values. It would not be easy, but it felt right in a way that simply keeping the money for himself never would have. His phone rang again, this time a number he did not recognize. Daniel answered cautiously and found himself talking to a woman named Dr. Sandra Mills, who worked as a music teacher at a public elementary school on the South Side. Margaret had apparently reached out to several schools on Daniel's behalf, mentioning the foundation and gauging interest in potential partnerships. "Mr. Rivera," Dr. Mills said, her voice carrying the distinctive weariness of educators in underfunded schools. "If what Ms. Chen told me is true, if you're really serious about providing instruments and instruction to students who couldn't otherwise afford it, then I have about 40 kids who would benefit immediately. We have no music program anymore, budget cuts eliminated it 3 years ago, and these children are growing up without any exposure to the arts. If you can help with that, it would be life-changing for them." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm completely serious, Dr. Mills. That's exactly what I want to do. Can we meet? I'd like to hear more about your students and figure out how the foundation can support them." They scheduled a meeting for the following week, and when Daniel hung up, he had to sit down on the basement stairs because his legs felt unsteady. This was it, the moment when abstract planning became concrete action. Real children with real needs, waiting for resources he now had the ability to provide. The responsibility felt enormous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. Over the next month, Daniel met with Dr. Mills and visited her school, walking through hallways covered in student artwork and hearing the chaos of children learning and growing. He met some of the kids she had identified, saw their eyes light up when he brought a guitar to demonstrate, watched them crowd around asking questions about music and instruments and whether they could really learn to play. One girl named Jasmine, maybe 10 years old with braids and a gap-toothed smile, told him she wanted to play violin more than anything, but her mom could not afford lessons or an instrument. "I hear violin music sometimes on TV," she said, "and it makes me feel something in my chest like my heart is singing along. Does that make sense?" Daniel had to turn away for a moment to compose himself because yes, that made perfect sense. That was exactly what music was supposed to do. He promised Jasmine she would have a violin and lessons, that he would make sure of it personally. Her smile when he said that was worth more than all of Robert's millions combined. He worked with Dr. Mills and James to create a pilot program at her school, providing 10 instruments and arranging for 2 music teachers to offer group lessons twice a week. The foundation would cover all costs, and students would be selected based on interest and need rather than existing skill. This would be the first project, the proof of concept that would hopefully expand to other schools across the city. The day they delivered the instruments to the school, Daniel brought Marcus along to help carry cases and set up the music room that Dr. Mills had secured for the program. Students lined the hallways watching, whispering excitedly to each other. When everything was set up and the first students came in for their initial lesson, Daniel stood in the back of the room and watched children hold instruments for the first time, saw their faces transform with wonder and possibility. Jasmine got her violin, and when the teacher showed her how to hold the bow and draw it across the strings, producing a scratchy but genuine note, she looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I'm making music," she whispered, as if she could not quite believe it was real. Daniel had to leave the room because he was crying too hard to hide it. He stood in the hallway with Marcus's hand on his shoulder, trying to pull himself together, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had led to this moment. A man collapsing on a sidewalk, a stranger performing CPR, a deathbed decision to give everything away, months of paperwork and planning, and now this, children discovering music, discovering parts of themselves they did not know existed. "This is what he wanted," Marcus said quietly. "Robert, this is what he was hoping you'd do." Daniel nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I know, I just wish he could see it. I wish he could know that it worked, that his last decision was the right one." They stayed for the entire first lesson, watching the teacher work with 10 kids of varying ages, showing them basic techniques and helping them produce their first sounds. It was chaotic and loud and beautiful, everything a music room should be. Daniel thought about Robert's basement, that perfect space filled with perfect instruments that sat silent for years, and felt grateful that he had found a way to break that silence, to fill the world with music instead of regret. That evening, Daniel returned to Robert's house and went straight to the office. He sat at the desk where Robert had spent so much time alone and pulled out a notebook. He wrote a letter, knowing no one would read it but needing to write it anyway, a one-sided conversation with a dead man who had changed his life. "Dear Robert," he began, "today we started the first program in your name. 10 kids at a South Side school now have instruments and teachers, opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. One of them is a girl named Jasmine who wants to play violin because it makes her heart sing. I thought you should know about her, should know that your instruments are finally being used the way you hoped they would be when you bought them for Michael." He wrote about his plans for expansion, about conversations with other schools, about the foundation structure and the sustainability model Patricia was helping him build. He wrote about moving into the house, about his intention to make it a living space rather than a shrine, about having music students over for practice sessions and master classes with the vintage instruments. "I still don't fully understand why you chose me," Daniel wrote near the end. "I just did what anyone should do, what basic human decency requires, but I'm trying to honor your faith in me. I'm trying to build something that justifies the gift you gave. I hope wherever you are, if you can somehow know what's happening, I hope you're proud. I hope you see that your last act mattered more than all the mistakes that came before it. Thank you for trusting me with this. I won't let you down." He signed the letter and folded it carefully, placing it in the desk drawer with Robert's journal. Then he sat back in the chair and looked around the office, this room where Robert had spent so much time wrestling with his regrets. Daniel made a silent promise that this room would see different emotions from now on, that it would be a place of planning and creation rather than mourning, that Robert's legacy would be about what he enabled in his death rather than what he failed at in his life. 1 year after Margaret Chen's phone call changed everything, Daniel stood in the garden behind Robert's house, now his house, watching the sun set over Lincoln Park. The space had transformed dramatically in the past 12 months, as had Daniel himself. The garden that had been overgrown and neglected now bloomed with careful tending, a mix of flowers and herbs that Daniel had planted himself, needing the physical work of gardening to ground him when everything else felt surreal. The house behind him was full of sounds it had not heard in years, maybe ever. A student was practicing cello in the music room, the notes occasionally wavering but gaining confidence with each measure. Upstairs, 2 teenagers were working on a songwriting project in what had been Michael's room, a space Daniel had finally gathered the courage to transform into a collaborative studio. The preserved shrine to a dead son had become a creative hub for living young people, which felt like the right kind of honoring. The Robert Ashford Music Foundation had grown beyond anything Daniel had imagined in those early planning sessions. What started as a pilot program at Dr. Mills's school had expanded to 7 schools across Chicago, serving nearly 200 students. The foundation provided instruments through a lending library system, funded group and individual lessons, and offered master classes with professional musicians who volunteered their time. Several students had already won spots in competitive youth orchestras, something that would have been impossible without access to quality instruments and instruction. Daniel had moved into the house 6 months ago, finally committing to making it his home rather than just a place he visited. It had been strange at first, sleeping in Robert's master bedroom, cooking in Robert's kitchen, occupying space that belonged to someone else's life. But gradually the house had adapted to Daniel's presence, becoming a hybrid of what it had been and what it was becoming. Robert's architectural drawings still hung on the walls, but now they shared space with photos from foundation events and posters for student recitals. The formal dining room that had sat empty for years now hosted monthly dinners where Daniel cooked for scholarship recipients and their families, filling the space with exactly the kind of gathering Robert had set the table for but never experienced. Marcus had moved in as well, taking one of the spare bedrooms and helping manage the foundation's social media and outreach. Having a roommate kept the house from feeling too large and lonely, and Marcus's design skills had been invaluable in creating marketing materials and grant applications. They had developed a rhythm of cohabitation that worked, respecting each other's space while enjoying shared meals and conversation. Daniel still performed music, but differently now. He played at foundation events and school assemblies, demonstrating for students and leading group performances. He had recorded an album finally, funding it himself without worrying about the cost, using several of Robert's vintage instruments to create something that honored both his own artistic vision and the collection's legacy. The album was dedicated to Robert's memory, with proceeds going to the foundation. It had not made much money or garnered much attention, but that was not the point anymore. The point was creating art that mattered rather than art that sold. The cello music from downstairs ended, followed by the sound of a case being closed and footsteps on the stairs. A moment later, Maya appeared in the garden doorway. She was 15, a student from Dr. Mills's school who had shown exceptional talent and dedication. The foundation had provided her with one of the vintage cellos and connected her with a professional teacher. In the past year, she had progressed so rapidly that her teacher believed she had a real shot at conservatory admission. "I'm heading out, Mr. Rivera," Maya said, using the formal address despite Daniel's repeated insistence that she call him Daniel. "Thank you for letting me practice here. My apartment is so loud I can never concentrate." "Anytime, Maya, you sounded great today. How's the piece coming for your audition?" Her face lit up with excitement and nervousness. "It's getting there. Ms. Peterson thinks I'm ready, but I'm terrified I'll mess up. This audition could change everything." Daniel walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be amazing. And remember, no matter what happens with the audition, you have a future in music if you want it. The foundation will make sure of that." Robert made sure of that. Maya nodded, her expression growing more serious. "I still can't believe a man I never met cared enough about kids like me to do all this. It's kind of overwhelming when I think about it." "He didn't know you specifically," Daniel said. "But he knew kids like you existed, talented and passionate but without resources. And he decided that mattered enough to give everything he had. That's his legacy, Maya. You're his legacy." After Maya left, Daniel returned to the garden and sat on the bench he had installed near the back fence. His phone buzzed with a message from Patricia, his financial advisor, confirming their meeting next week to review the foundation's first annual report. The numbers were strong, showing sustainable growth that would allow them to expand programming without depleting the endowment. Robert's careful investments and conservative management meant the foundation could operate in perpetuity if managed wisely, helping students long after Daniel himself was gone. He thought about the anniversary, about how much had changed in 1 year. In some ways, it felt like a lifetime had passed since that phone call from Margaret. He was a different person now, shaped by responsibility and purpose in ways his younger street musician self could never have imagined. But in other ways, he was exactly the same, still driven by the belief that music mattered, that art was essential, that giving people access to beauty and creative expression was not charity but justice. The past year had not been without struggles and doubts. There were moments when Daniel felt crushed by the weight of managing the foundation, when the administrative work and fundraising and strategic planning felt overwhelming. There were times he resented Robert for putting this responsibility on him, for not just leaving the money to an established charity that had professional staff and systems already in place. There were moments of imposter syndrome when he wondered whether someone with an actual background in nonprofits or education would be doing this better. But then he would visit a school and see a child holding an instrument for the first time, or attend a recital where students performed pieces they had been working on for months, or receive an email from a parent thanking him for giving their kid a chance they never thought possible. In those moments, all the struggle felt worthwhile, felt like exactly what he was supposed to be doing with his life. Daniel had also reconnected with his own music in unexpected ways. Having financial security freed him to experiment and take risks with his songwriting, to collaborate with other musicians without worrying about whether it would pay. He had started a weekly open mic night at a community center, providing a space for local artists to perform and connect. Some of the foundation students came to perform as they gained confidence, testing out their skills in front of a supportive audience. The vintage instruments got played regularly now, either by advanced students during masterclasses or by visiting professional musicians who came to support the foundation. The 1937 Martin that had sat untouched for years was now one of the most requested instruments, its distinctive tone captured in dozens of student recordings. The instruments were fulfilling their purpose finally, creating music instead of gathering dust, connecting people instead of sitting as monuments to disconnection. Daniel had also made peace with Robert's ghost in a way. He had spent the year learning more about the man, reading through his journals and talking to people who had known him professionally. The picture that emerged was complicated, someone who was brilliant and difficult, generous and emotionally unavailable, capable of great empathy in abstract but struggling with intimacy in particular. Robert had been human and flawed, and trying his best with the tools he had, just like everyone else. Understanding Robert's full humanity made the inheritance easier to accept. This was not a perfect man bestowing wisdom on an unworthy recipient. This was a struggling person reaching out in death to create the connection he had failed to create in life, using the only currency he had left to say something he had never learned to say in person. The money was not really about money at all. It was about hope and redemption and the possibility that our final acts might matter more than all our accumulated failures. As the sky darkened from purple to deep blue, Daniel heard voices from inside the house. Marcus was talking to someone, probably the teenagers finishing up their songwriting session. Laughter echoed out into the garden, young and unself-conscious, the sound of people comfortable and creative and fully themselves. This house that had been so silent for so long was full of exactly that kind of energy now, bustling with life and purpose. Daniel's phone rang, and he saw Margaret Chen's name on the screen. They had stayed in touch over the past year, checking in regularly about foundation business and occasionally just talking as friends. Margaret had become something like a mentor to Daniel, guiding him through the legal and administrative aspects of running a nonprofit, while also offering perspective when he felt overwhelmed. "Daniel, I hope I'm not calling too late," Margaret said when he answered. "Not at all, what's up? I was just reviewing the Foundation's annual report that Patricia sent over, and I wanted to call and tell you how impressed I am with what you've built. The number of students served, the partnerships with schools, the sustainability of the financial model, all of it exceeds what I hoped for when we first discussed your ideas. Robert would be incredibly proud." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Hearing that validation from someone who had known Robert, who had witnessed his final wishes and worked to make them reality, meant more than he could express. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a lot. I think about him every day, wonder if I'm doing this right, if this is really what he imagined." "It's better than what he imagined," Margaret said firmly. "Robert had the intention and the resources, but he didn't have your vision or your ability to connect with people. You've taken his gift and multiplied it in ways he never could have on his own. That's the best possible outcome, Daniel. That's what inheritance is supposed to be, one generation enabling the next to build something greater." After they hung up, Daniel sat in the darkening garden for a while longer, letting Margaret's words sink in. He thought about the chain of events that led to this moment, the seemingly random collision of one man's heart attack and another man's decision to help. How easily it could have gone differently. If Daniel had been performing a block away, if he had been on break, if he had been one of the 30 people who walked past, Robert would have died on that sidewalk and his estate would have gone to the state and none of this would exist. But it had happened this way. Daniel had been exactly where he needed to be, had made the choice that aligned with his values, and that choice had rippled outward in ways impossible to predict or control. One moment of basic human decency had transformed into this, into hundreds of children learning music, into a foundation that would outlive both Robert and Daniel himself, into a legacy that redeemed a lifetime of regret. Daniel finally stood and walked back into the house, closing the garden door behind him. The teenagers were leaving, thanking him for the space and promising to have their song finished by next week. Marcus was in the kitchen making tea, and he poured a second cup for Daniel without being asked. They sat together at the kitchen island, the same island where Robert had probably eaten alone for years, and talked about nothing important while the house settled around them. Later that night, Daniel went to Robert's office, his office now, and pulled out the letter he had written a year ago. He read it again, seeing how naive some of his early ideas had been, how much he had learned in the months since. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a new letter, an anniversary update to a dead man who would never read it but who somehow felt present anyway. "Dear Robert," he wrote, "it's been a year since everything changed. I want you to know that we served 197 students this year through the foundation. 197 kids who might never have touched an instrument if you hadn't made the decision you made in that hospital bed. I keep thinking about the mathematics of legacy, how your one life has now touched almost 200 others, and how those 200 will touch thousands more as they grow up and share what they've learned." He wrote about specific students, about Maya and her cello audition, about a boy named Derek who started with no musical background and discovered he had perfect pitch, about Jasmine who got her violin and was now playing in a youth orchestra. He wrote about the challenges of running a nonprofit and the joy of watching something grow beyond himself. He wrote about living in the house and making it a home, about honoring Robert's memory by making sure the space served the living rather than mourning the dead. "I've learned that inheritance isn't just about receiving," Daniel wrote near the end. "It's about stewardship and transformation. You gave me resources, but more importantly, you gave me purpose. You looked at my life from the outside and saw potential I didn't see in myself. Maybe that's the real gift, not the money, but the belief. Thank you for believing I could do this. Thank you for your last act of faith in a stranger. I'm trying every day to prove you right." He signed and dated the letter, placing it in the drawer with the others, a growing archive of one-sided conversations. Then he turned off the office light and went upstairs to bed, to the room that had been Robert's and was now his, in the house that had been Robert's and was now full of music and life, and everything Robert had wanted but never achieved himself. Daniel lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the creaking boards and humming refrigerator and distant traffic. But underneath those sounds was something new, something that would have been impossible a year ago. It was the echo of music, the memory of all the notes played in the basement and the rooms throughout the day, the residue of creative energy that now lived in these walls. The house sang quietly to itself, and Daniel fell asleep to that soundtrack, grateful for the strange and circuitous path that had led him here, grateful for a dying man's wisdom and a stranger's gift, grateful for the chance to build something beautiful from the pieces of someone else's broken life. Build something beautiful from the pieces of someone else's broken life.